So before we get started, I'm going to give you a quiz. And I show you this picture as well because this actually has influenced how I teach entrepreneurship at Cal, my experiences in the military. But before we get to that, who are these individuals? Upper left-hand corner? Bill Gates, Paul Allen. Upper right-hand corner? Steve Jobs and? Steve Wozniak. Lower left-hand corner? Okay, 75% grade right now. Here's the tough one. Who's the lower right? No, that is not me. Boy, I've gained some weight. Who is it?
Founder of Snapchat.
Yes, 100%. What do they all have in common? They're all dropouts. None of them went to college. So how can I possibly teach entrepreneurship at a college? How is that possible? And that's the problem I deal with. We have this feeling, we have this knowledge that to be an entrepreneur, it's in your DNA. You're born that way. You somehow have the ability to look into the future. And so if you go to college, it actually interferes with your process. It interferes with your creativity. This concept is so powerful here in the Bay Area that there are certain people, investors, angel funders, who will not fund people who go to college. In fact, Peter Thiel, one of the first investors in Facebook, has started a scholarship. And his scholarship requires that you drop out of school. And if you do, he gives you $100,000. I've already had to talk to 2 students about not dropping out. So you can imagine the challenge I have when I'm trying to convince my students that there's actually a way to teach entrepreneurship. So I'm going to share with you that process today. And to help you understand my point of view on this, I'm going to first talk about what I call the myth of the entrepreneur, the myth of the amateur. And I'm going to pick on this guy a little, Steve Jobs. So, does anyone know where Steve Jobs was born? Where was he born? He was born in Madison, Wisconsin. He was given up for adoption. And a family living in Cupertino, in the heart of the Bay Area, in the heart of Silicon Valley, adopted him. So this is my first point. If Steve Jobs was born an entrepreneur, he could have been adopted anywhere. And he would have somehow risen to the top. My feeling is he got lucky. And so I'm going to first tell you a little about what makes this area so special when it comes to technical innovation. So about the time that Steve Jobs was born, there was a technical revolution happening in the Bay Area. And it was around a new type of device, the semiconductor industry, wherein William Shockley, who's one of the co-inventors of the transistor, formed a company, and he was such a bad leader that 8 of his young engineers left the company. He referred to them as the treacherous 8. Well, those treacherous 8 went on to form all of these companies in the next 10 years. In effect, they created in the 1950s and 60s a new type of ecosystem that would speed up the process of innovation. Today, we benefit from that system that they created. So I'm going to tell you a little about the aspects of our system here. Our system is so powerful that over the last 25 years, the entire European Union countries have created one startup company that has rose to be one of the top 500 largest companies in the world. This little Bay Area has created 30 of them. So how do we do it? First, we have great universities. We're standing in the best one, right? There's others around here also that help a little. But the important thing is, our universities are special in a variety of different ways. First of all, we spend a lot of time and money on science and engineering at Stanford, at Cal, and also many of the smaller community schools around here as well. A lot of research dollars pass through these universities. And we have international reputations. So the Bay Area does not somehow produce smarter people. We attract smarter people. 30% of my class at any time at Haas is from people from other countries. And many of them want to stay here after they're done learning. So we have this wonderful magnet for human capital in the Bay Area. Might have something to do with the weather as well, but that's one of the reasons why I came here. The other thing about the universities is we don't suffer from what I call the ivory tower. The faculty is encouraged to participate and get our hands dirty in the world. And that already started in the 1950s and 1960s. So places like Cal, places like Stanford were one of the first schools that offered courses to people who were no longer in school, that needed to keep on learning in order to do their jobs. And I think that's an important aspect that is often forgotten as well. We have a very strong legal and tax system that actually supports innovation, no matter what you hear Texans saying. They're just jealous. So first of all, if you compare us to other countries who are trying to create Silicon Valleys, one of the things you have to be able to protect is intellectual property. That's a core tenet of any innovative system. The second part is we have a legal system wherein lawyers understand the process of building companies. I had a student 3 years ago from Haas. He needed a lot of intellectual property work to be done to get the company off the ground. We found a lawyer that offered him $40,000 worth of free work, and if he was fortunate enough to raise money in his Series A, then he could pay the law firm back. I promise you, I'm from New York, I'm from Long Island. There's not a single lawyer on Long Island who would ever make that deal. One of the great revolutions was actually a financing revolution that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s. So if you had a great idea in 1940, how would you raise the money for it? Where would the money come from? A bank. So let's think about that. I go to a banker and I say, look, well, they didn't have PowerPoint back then, so I would say, look at this piece of paper. I wrote it on a napkin while I was in a bar, and this is going to change the world. This is going to be a billion-dollar company. Can I have $5 million? What's the banker going to say? Where's your collateral? Right? Bankers only loan you money when you don't need it. So you can't go to a bank in 1940 to get money. How else could you get money in 1940? Family, yes. One of the only ways to raise money prior to the Bay Area in 1950s was through family. So what are the odds that your family is wealthy enough to fund your startup, and it happened to have children that were ambitious and smart enough to come up with the idea? You've now created a world where you reduce the population who could actually be entrepreneurs. So the way the Bay Area created the meritocracy, the way the Bay Area allowed adopted children like Steve Jobs to explore new ideas is through a new system of VC and angel funding. So first, VCs. One of the treacherous eight, Eugene Kleiner, formed a venture capital firm called Kleiner Perkins. And what they decided to start doing is place multiple bets on 10, 20, 30 of these different startup companies, because they knew a good amount of them would fail, but some would make it. And if they made it, and they made it really big, then they could pump more money back into that system. The other radical invention is called the stock option. So the stock option blew up Karl Marx's notion of worker and capital. It made every single person in the firm both a worker and an owner. That's why there are no unions in the Bay Area, at least within the tech sector. But you can imagine what that does. When you own something, it changes your motivation, right? You become much more aggressive in trying to make the whole organization succeed. And again, it was the treacherous eight who introduced this notion in their companies like Intel. Stock options. So when there is a liquidity event here in the Bay Area, and now you have this group of employees become wealthy, they turn into angels. Angels. It's almost this duty that people have here, that if they're fortunate enough to gain from the system that's created, they pour some of that money back into the system. So now you could be someone like Steve Jobs and have an idea and turn to angels and turn to VCs. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter if you go to college. If the idea is good enough and the team's right, you can get funded for your ideas. And finally, that ties into the last part, the culture. I mentioned that I came from Long Island. Grew up on Long Island. I was very fortunate. My dad was a Dunkin' Donuts baker. I grew up pretty tough. But we had this culture on Long Island where most of us felt that you needed to screw the person next to you before they screwed you. Try driving on Long Island Expressway and you'll see what I mean. What shocked me when I moved out here in '97 is it seemed like everyone wanted to help me. I'd be sitting in a restaurant, be talking about an idea. I'd only known the people for 5 minutes, and they were like, oh, that's a great idea, and you can do this, and you might try this, and I know these 3 people who could help you with that. I call it a culture of abundance versus a culture of scarcity. For some reason, the Bay Area has this notion of if we all work together, we will all benefit more. And it's hard to explain, you just have to live it. There's another culture that's part of startup community. And that was created by one of the treacherous eight. His name was Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel. And very early on in Intel, he drew this graph. And he named it Moore's Law. Does anyone know what Moore's Law is? Moore's Law, yes?
It says that, it essentially says the number of transistors on an IC will double about every 18 months.
Excellent. Everyone hear that? The number of transistors on a chip will double every 18 months to 2 years. Another way of saying that is the computing power of a chip will double every 18 months to 2 years. Another way to say that is every 2 years, the price of computing power will be cut in half. He made this graph very early on in the beginning of the company. And remember, this is logarithmic, okay? This is reality. And all the dots are different types of processors that were created. Amazingly, Moore's Law held. But here's the dirty secret about Moore's Law. There is no law, there's no natural law that says that Technology has to improve that quickly. This is Moore's ambition. Early on in Intel, he said, this is what we're going to achieve. And any company that works in our supply chain has to buy into this ambition as well. So it's the Bay Area's ambition which is unique. Imagine if Detroit had this ambition, right? Every 2 years, we're going to double the mileage on a car. God, I wish that was true. But crazy enough, this is held for so many other technologies in the Bay Area. So it's part of the culture, it's part of our ambition. And so I need to teach the Haas students, if you take this path, you have to believe in this, and you have to push yourselves harder than you ever had before. This is one of the hardest paths you can possibly take to be an entrepreneur. So let's get back to Steve Jobs. So first off, he was lucky enough to be adopted here, right at the time when the system of innovation was being created. When he was 4 years old, there was an international crisis in the world, well, at least in the United States. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik. It had beat the United States to space. Why was that problematic? Many of you might not know, and my son actually just went on a field trip in Marin and looked at Nike missile systems. During the 1950s, there was a government project to build an air defense system around North America. It was 3 times more expensive than the Manhattan Project. It got completed in 1957, and then the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It kind of blew up the whole system, right? You don't have to deliver nuclear weapons with bombers. Now you could go over the top if you wanted to. Eisenhower decided to push vast amounts of funds into science and technology in 1958 and 1959. He created NASA. He created the NSF. He started giving schools like Cal lots of money to do research. He also created a group called ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, in the early 60s. ARPA was part of the Department of Defense, but one great insight that they had was if you want creativity, if you want innovation, it's not going to happen in a big organization. So they created ARPA and gave them funding, and they could work on any esoteric project they wanted. And so the most famous project from the 1960s was created by JCR Licklider called ARPANET. ARPANET. During the 80s, this became MILNET, and during the 90s, this became the internet. There's another project that was created by ARPA in the 1960s that most of you don't know about. Ivan Sutherland was a professor at MIT, and he came up with this concept of virtual reality, creating realities that are beyond our bodies. And initially, his concept was to augment the abilities of human beings. So the first experiment they tried was a pilot's helmet connected to a camera so they could zoom in and zoom out. Their eyesight can become 30 times better when they wanted to. But soon he realized that we don't need the camera. We can replace the camera with a computer. And the computer can generate the images and create the virtual reality. So he took his funding from ARPA and he set up a school at University of Utah to start figuring out how you make computers generate images. Not only how they generate images, how those images can move, how those images can move in relation to one another. And out of that program came some pretty interesting students. So all the students I'm going to mention over the next 10 minutes all graduated within 5 years from this ARPA-funded project. So Nolan Bushnell was a student at University of Utah, and he thought, this is an esoteric study we're doing. We're teaching computers how to make images. Let's turn them into games. So he moved out to the Bay Area, and he founded a company called Atari. Steve Jobs actually went to college. He went to college for a few months. And if you read the myth about Steve Jobs, the one thing he took from college was, I guess he took a class in calligraphy. And that changed everything. That opened his mind. When you drop out of college, you gotta get a job, right? You gotta pay the bills. So Steve Jobs' first job was at Atari. Why is this important? You see the box on the right? Who had one of those? I literally mowed about 5,000 lawns to save up to buy that. But you know what I bought? I bought the first instance of the computer being a consumer good. This is the first time that a computer is turned into something that we have in the home. And this is what Steve got to work on. We learn a little about Steve Jobs also while he's working there. He convinces Nolan that he can help redesign the board in the Atari prototype and make it more efficient and thus make it more cost effective. Problem is, he knows nothing about computer boards. So he talks to his friend, Steve Wozniak, to help him out. Steve's a few years older. Where do you think Steve's going to school? Cal. Yeah. He talks Steve to come in and help him out. And if Steve can help him out, then they'll split the bonus that Nolan promised him. He paid Steve $350 because Steve was successful at making the board more efficient. What Steve didn't know, Steve Wozniak didn't know until 20 years later, that he had negotiated a $5,000 bonus. It's his experience at Atari wherein it looks like the computer might be something that can be sold to a larger home audience. So Steve starts trying to find angel investors for his idea. So one he finds and who buys into the concept is named Mark McCullough. Mark is an old soul. He's a professional entrepreneur. He's been at it for about 12 years by this point. He's 33, 34 years old. He had worked at Intel and made a lot of money at Intel when they went public. So he decides to back Steve. That's a check for $250,000 for 1/3 of the company. But he realizes if you don't have any life experience, if you don't have college, you're actually not very good at building things. So Mark insists that he becomes the CEO. And Steve agrees. If you ever saw the first versions of the Apple, they pretty much look like Ataris. And you connect them to a cathode ray tube, which is a TV screen. It really took a visit to Xerox PARC, a research lab here in the Bay Area, for Steve Jobs to have his eyes open to the possibilities. This man's name is Alan Kay. Prior to being a researcher at Xerox PARC, guess where he did his graduate work? University of Utah, with Alan Sutherland on the virtual reality project. Whoop. Alan creates at Xerox PARC what we see in the upper right. He calls it GUI, Graphic User Interface. And the graphic user interface is controlled by something called a mouse. And so they build the Star 8000 system, and Xerox owns it. They own the personal computer. Steve Jobs gets a tour of the facility. He sees it, he understands it, And so he calls senior management on the East Coast of Xerox, much like he did with Nolan Bushnell, and he cuts a deal. You know, I didn't see too much that was of interest at Xerox, but there's one or two things. We'd like to pay you a small amount of money to use whatever we want. Supposedly, after he cuts that deal, he went back to Xerox PARC and literally was jumping up and down in joy because he had screwed over all the engineers like Alan Kay. And he got full use of that. The problem is, once you build one of these new technologies, you have to come up with uses for it. So this man, John Warnick, after he graduates from University of Utah, moves to the Bay Area, and he founds a company called Adobe. And Adobe creates all the tools to start manipulating graphics on these new types of machines called home computers. And so when Steve puts all the pieces together, it looks something like that. And you can see the middle one there, that's Adobe Illustrator. Steve Jobs was brilliant enough to cobble together these core technologies and package them as a consumer good and convince people that they need these things. He needed a lot of people, a lot of talented people, a lot of government funding, a lot of angel funding, and a lot of people that went to college to get him there at this point. So they have their IPO, he becomes a very wealthy man, and in 1985 he gets kicked out of his own company. And Mark McCullough is one of the people that wants him out. You're not born a great leader or manager. It's something that you have to learn. He was so bad that they just decided we need to get him out. He's hurting the company. So what do you do when you're 25 and have $120 million? You buy another company. So Steve bought a company called Pixar. Pixar was part of Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic. They made the Star Wars movies during the 1970s, and they had a digital group within Industrial Light and Magic. The founder of the digital group was a man named Ed Catmull. Guess where Ed did his graduate work? University of Utah in the graphics industry. And so Steve buys Pixar, and they're going to sell Pixar machines to render three-dimensional objects, and they're going to sell it as a B2B play with sophisticated machines that he's creating at another company put together next with the rendering software that Ed Catmull put together. For 6 years, this company flounders. Not a single VC invested $1 in Pixar. Steve Jobs ends up pumping 60 million of his own dollars into this company. He now owns 90% of it when they have the pivot. And when I say pivot here at Haas, I mean a company that has a business model that's going nowhere, and then they change course. And sometimes when you change course, that's the aha moment. So in order to encourage people to buy these machines, they built these demos. And the demos showed cute objects talking to each other, interacting with each other. And one of the friends of one of Steve's partners thought, wow, these demos are so cool, why not enter it in the Academy Award shorts? They won the Academy Award, Disney sees it, Disney calls him up and says, can you make a movie, an entire movie using this technology? Toy Story is the movie that is created by Pixar. And here's a brilliant move by Steve Jobs. He times the IPO of Pixar with the same week that Toy Story is coming out. And his idea is if Toy Story is a flop, we pull the IPO. If it takes off, well, that's what happened, right? Steve Jobs makes most of his wealth on Pixar, not on Apple. But by this point, he's actually a pretty good entrepreneur. He's actually a pretty good manager, a pretty good leader. It took him millions of dollars and 15 years to figure it out. And so he's invited back to help a floundering Apple. Believe it or not, Apple's share price was down to $2 when Steve Jobs comes back. And what they decide to do is take what they created with the original Apple and combine it with the other ARPANET project. And they create the iMac. So the I in the iMac and the iPhone and the iPod and all the others doesn't mean I, it means internet. So the first model that comes out after Steve joins, you plug it right into the internet, which was taking off during that period. Also, this is the second version of the iMac. It looks exactly like the lamp that they had at Pixar. So you see kind of how one is bleeding over into the other right here. So who commercializes the ARPANET? Well, it's the man on the left, Jim Clark. I hate to say it, but guess where Jim did his graduate work? University of Utah, during those same 5 years, funded by the government. He gets a job at Stanford as a professor, and he starts working on new high-speed processors that allow this 3D rendering to occur. And this is kind of another hint back to our Moore's law, right? The processing speeds actually started slowing down in the 80s. So the government, once again, did a massive government push to get funding into the universities to figure out new ways to speed up processing. And actually, Jim Clark was on a team that started coming up with RISC processing. And that's what he uses in his new company, Silicon Graphics. Silicon Graphics were used mainly by engineers with CAD programs to design things. It also is the first time, actually, prior to Pixar, that 3D virtual reality is used in movies. If you've seen Tron, the old Tron, if you saw Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, and of course Jurassic Park, these are all created by Silicon Graphics machines. So he's wildly successful with Silicon Graphics, and in the mid-90s he decides to try to commercialize the ARPANET. So he finds a young 22-year-old named Mark Andreessen studying at the University of Illinois, and they create a company called Netscape, which really causes the dot-com boom of the 1990s. And so what the iMac is the two programs coming together, the two government programs coming together. During the last phase of his life, Steve Jobs was honored as being one of the greatest entrepreneurs ever to live. And the myth of Steve Jobs grew. The reality is, innovation occurs within a system. Was Steve Jobs critically important? Yes, he was. Of course he was. But if you dig a little deeper, you see how important the universities are, the angels are, the VCs are, the government is at funding innovation. So when I think about how to build a curriculum of entrepreneurship, I actually borrow a lot from my military experience. Steve Jobs is what I call an amateur entrepreneur. Every profession, and entrepreneurship is a profession. Every profession has has amateurs, and as the profession progresses, it becomes professionalized. So what do I mean by that? It's the Civil War, and you want to be a doctor. How do you become a doctor during the Civil War? You say you're a doctor. That's all you got to do. You say, I'm a doctor. You go find a battlefield and you start operating. You kill a lot of people along the way, but a few doctors during the 1850s and 1860s actually got pretty good at their craft. Eventually, Johns Hopkins says, there's probably a better way to do this. So they form a medical school. And at the medical school, you learn theory, you practice, and then eventually you can become a doctor. Well, naval aviation evolved the same way. If you wanted to be an aviator the first 15 years after the Wright brothers, you just strapped on a plane. And we know some of the famous ones, right? The amateur phase of professions is always romantic. So we know who Amelia Earhart is. We know who Charles Lindbergh is. We don't know the thousands of aviators who died by the age of 25 trying to figure it out. So this man right here, Naval Academy grad, 1890, his name is William Moffett. Those who live around here know Moffett Field, which isn't far away. He was actually a ship driver, but he saw the potential of aviation for the Navy, so he decided, let's turn it into a profession. In order to do things like this, we should find a better way. So that was my experience. I got to learn to be an aviator. The son of a Dunkin' Donuts baker got turned into an aviator through a process. So what is that process? Well, at Annapolis, we studied a lot of this. The theory of how things fly, how your engines work, how your avionics work. We spent a lot of time in these. I'd say for every 1 hour of flying, we spent 100 hours in a simulator. Full circle. Ivan Sutherland's group, 1970s. Guess what the first companies that actually grew out of that besides Adobe and Atari? Companies that created flight simulators. Flight simulators were the first practical use of virtual reality. I think that one, I flew in one similar to that. I think it cost like $200 million. And my sons now play Wii, and Falcon 14 on Wii is much better than the flight simulator I used to fly. And then there's practice. They didn't give us the F-14 to start with or the F-18 to start with. They started a gradual process. But the good news is we start learning to do very dangerous things, but we've extracted the risk of the process. So you end up with professional aviators who are better than the amateurs, and the amount of planes and the amount of lives we lose is a lot less. So that's how I built the curriculum here. We have 40 years of knowledge of best practices. We understand the process of building companies in the Bay Area. So I always ask the class on day one, who's got an idea for a startup? See, about a third of the class, they shoot their hands up. Then I say, who has no clue? And about a third of the class is kind of like that. I say to the people who have no clue, congratulations, you're so much farther ahead than the people who have ideas right now. Because the people who have ideas don't even know how to think of an idea yet. So we spend the first 5 weeks looking at opportunities, studying what the contextual landscape is upon which we're going to build this idea. What are the technical systems that are emerging, like virtual reality, like ARPANET? There are ones today that are in the early stages like those tech systems were 20, 30 years ago. We look at what are the trends? Debt ceiling, demographic trends, the fact that people are giving and giving more, systems like Facebook taking off. Building a company is no different than surfing. You can have the best surfboard, the nicest wetsuit, but if there are no waves, you're not going anywhere, right? So before we come up with our ideas, let's understand the context of our world a little better. And so my class last week went through that phase. All 60 people had their ideas, and then they were given 3 minutes and 3 slides to convince their classmates to quit their ideas and join them. Why do I do that? Well, that's what Steve Jobs was great at. If you can't be a salesperson, you can't be an entrepreneur. I'm sorry. You're trying to create something that doesn't exist in the world. So you have to be able to sell a future that you're going to help build. Resources. How do you garner resources? The first time you talk to a venture capitalist and the first time you negotiate a term sheet shouldn't be the first time you talk to a venture capitalist and the first time you look at a term sheet. We can practice these things. So we bring in lawyers, we bring in venture capitalists, we bring in angels, we bring in entrepreneurs who are at different stages of the process, and they tell their story about how they garner resources. Finally, team. What type of partner do you need? Think of Wozniak and Jobs. What a great partnership. Your partners should have skill sets and abilities that you don't have. So we spend a lot of time identifying proper partners. How you build a team. How do you lead a team? How do you manage a team? How do you motivate a team? And what we're hoping to create are some winners. Some ideas with the proper team, with some funding that can eventually keep on growing. So each semester, the class ends up with about 12 startups. We narrow it down to about 3 or 4, which get funding. So I'll give you a little example of one from Haas 1 year ago. Idea didn't exist 1 year ago today. By the end of class, the model, the business plan, the revenue spreadsheets, the cost spreadsheets were all worked out. He realized that as an MBA, if he wants to build a medical company, he might not want 2 or 3 other MBAs. So he went down to Stanford and found 2 Stanford doctors to be his partners. In December, they started working with a company called Indiegogo. Anyone know what Indiegogo is? Yes? Crowdfunding. There's a new revolution going on in finance. It's called crowdfunding. And I'm proud to say that Indiegogo is leading it, and they came from our program 5 years ago. So what's so nice is one of the options for our program now is if you need some core funding to do your beta testing, just hook up with our former Cal grads at Indiegogo, and they'll help you do it. In January, they ran a $25,000 campaign pre-selling their doctor service. What their doctor service is, think Uber meets FaceTime. You can get an on-demand doctor visit, high-def video instantaneously, or within an hour or 2. It's called PlushCare. They raised their $25,000. By the end of last spring, they had done their beta testing, they collected the metrics. It was good enough to raise $750,000 from angels. And now we're at the stage where they're talking to VCs. They've built, it's no longer a prototype, they've built out the system with the $750,000. They're talking to VCs. They've practiced talking to VCs. They know how to negotiate with VCs. They've built a lot of value already before even talking to a VC. So they're in a very strong negotiating position. And they should be raising about $2 million now to kick off 2015. Listen, Steve Jobs is a wonderful entrepreneur, wonderful innovator. I hope what I got across today is that entrepreneurs are not born, they're made, and they're made at Haas. So I'm going to open it up. We have 10 minutes. I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have a question, can you please go to one of the microphones because we're actually recording.
You were going to say they're conceived at Haas.
Yes, they're conceived at Haas. Questions, if you could please go to the mic.
First of all, thank you very much. I've been asking this question, are entrepreneurs born or made, for such a long time. My question is this. Out of all the students who now have built their companies and are successful, how many of them came with the idea first that you helped polish through your teaching?
I'd say that many of them had an inkling, but that inkling was not the actual product or service that they ended up building. So Indiegogo is a perfect example. Indiegogo, the initial idea was independent funding through groups. The word crowdfunding wasn't even invented yet. They understood that both the music industry and record industry was being destroyed in part by digitization. So they wanted to create a new way for independent artists and independent films to get funded. That was what was created in the class. How it evolved, and the reason why Kleiner, see how it's all connected, Kleiner Perkins just put $40 million into them, is that the 2010 Jobs Act is allowing, for the first time, non-accredited investors to invest in startups. So people with under $1 million in liquid wealth can invest in startups. So what you'll start seeing Indiegogo move to now is a crowdfunding angel platform to fund startups. So that's very different from what they were working on in class. Yes?
Hi. Wonderful talk, thank you. I'm a Wharton grad, so
Congratulations.
go Haas. I have a question. When you first spoke about Peter Thiel's $100,000 challenge, what did you say to those kids? Because, you know, we're spending a lot of money on ours, keeping them in school.
Yeah. Both my students were engineers, and you can learn, I guess, the flavor of the day without schooling. You can hack yourself to some proficiency. But you really need 4 years, I think, of core technical training to become adept at these different areas. And so that's what they were trading in, right? I helped them maybe look at the longer term. It seemed like an easy path right now. There's a boom going on right now. That's the other part, right? This is a boom-bust town. Since the gold rush, this is a boom-bust town. We're living in a boom again. 5 years ago, I would have 60 seats available in my class, and I'd have 50 people that want to become entrepreneurs. The last 2 semesters, I've had 50 or 60 on the wait list. Because everyone wants to be an entrepreneur right now. But that will fade, that will pass. And the professional entrepreneurs will be left. So get your degree, just like Wozniak, right? He almost finished it. He ended up going to Apple, so he did about 3.5 years worth. And then in 1985, he actually came back to Cal and finished his degree then. So finish your degree, and you still have plenty of time to be an entrepreneur. You have a lifetime to be an entrepreneur.
Loved your talk. Quick question about being a risk taker. It seems to me that entrepreneurs have to be willing to break out of their box or their shell. And how did you come from your experience at the military academy where they want you to conform but you have to be a leader?
Yeah.
We say that partly because our son is at the Naval Academy now, and he reminds me of you. He's kind of a guy that wants to go out and do things, but I'm just curious how you went from that environment to where you're at now, experiencing breaking new challenges.
Sure. So just from my own experience, and my wife's a 4th generation San Franciscan. When we first met, I told her I went to school at Annapolis, and she's like, "What's that?" I have no idea. Most people get their notion of what military people are like through Hollywood. And what I've noticed is that some of the biggest personalities I know, some of the people who can handle uncertainty and risk, are Annapolis grads. It's a bit of a contradiction. How is that possible? What I struggle with, and I'm going to be honest with you, and I actually have to bring in examples, and we have a class about risk-taking and courage with the MBAs. Sometimes the MBAs are so used to spending a life being on a track. You know, I need to do this to get into this undergrad school, then I need to do this internship to get this job, and then I need to do this job to get it into the MBA program. If you're living a life where you're on the track, and then maybe you have $100,000 of debt hanging over your head, I've seen a few times where great ideas were created in the class, they built the startup around it, all enthused about it, graduation comes and they panic. They panic and they don't do it. And they go work for a big company. That happens a lot. And that's okay. That's okay. Because you have to be willing and able to handle uncertainty if you're going to take the entrepreneurial track. And that's not for everyone. That was one of Steve Jobs' great abilities, right? He thrived in that environment. So it's not for everyone either. Absolutely.
So a lot of the examples that you gave and that I've seen people have been successful is they're out in the world doing something else for 15, 20 years in an industry, and then one day the idea pops up because they see that. And so, you know, you could make the argument that Steve Jobs was that Bill Gates, in some sense, it wasn't 15 or 20 years, but a lot of the successful entrepreneurs are doing something else and then the big idea hits them. How does that compare to being in a classroom and forcing, the idea of entrepreneurship?
What I've seen happen to some students also is, and I have a few examples right now. After graduation, they went and worked for the big company. Something inside them had changed during the process of the class, that 2 or 3 years after working for the big company, they identify a small promising startup in the Bay Area, and then they go work for that startup. And what's really neat about that, and I think that's even the more important outcome. Yeah, we produce a few startups each year, but what we're also producing is what I call professional entrepreneurs. A cadre of people who can go work for smaller startups and bring the skill sets to that startup that they learned. One of my students got in very early at Uber because he saw the potential of the business model. And the head of Uber, Travis, is an amateur entrepreneur. It's his first time around the block. He's not a very good leader, to be honest. And my student actually is becoming more and more important in that company because he brings tools with him that he learned at Haas that are necessary to grow a company. That's another great outcome.
From being an entrepreneur, I was told that you have to be able to gamble on yourself and make a, so to say, a jump, sort of jumping out into the world and pretty much not taking anybody else's opinion into consideration. What was that one point in your life where you had to really jump out and say, screw it, I'm going to do it?
So I think there's two parts to that. I agree with that. You can't be necessarily a people pleaser. So if you think it's the right path, you got to take the right path. That's part of leadership, that's part of management, that's part of being an entrepreneur. What I will disagree with is the point of you need to isolate yourself from other people's opinions. The best entrepreneurs I know, the best leaders I know, realize that they're not that smart. They can't do it on their own. So what becomes most important is the type of team you attract to your startup. And it's the team and the abilities of all the team members which create the innovation. So you have to be strong enough to sometimes say, no, we're going in this direction. But someone who doesn't take other people's opinions into account is never going to be successful. Yes.
My youngest son is on the autism spectrum, high functioning, very clever. He has two brothers who are CS majors, one here, one at USC. I think of them as maybe a team. Have you observed people with Asperger, high functioning autism, having trouble or having success as they become part of these teams that you've watched?
Yes, I'm actually teaching this semester in the I School, the School of Information. So all my graduate students are computer science, database engineers, user interface designers, and data scientists. And their personalities on the spectrum are somewhat different from my Cal students. So the way we're forming our teams right now is to match up properly the attributes that everyone brings to the table, right? So if you're an incredible programmer, but maybe you struggle with being able to describe what the startup's trying to accomplish, well, team up with someone who actually is very good at that, but also understands how to work with you. So it's team through diversity, which I think are the winning teams. And we have 40 years of data around this. Now, we've done studies around what makes good teams. We also know that the average age of professional entrepreneurs is between 35 and 45. So this myth of the 19-year-old, the 20-year-old that we're fed by the mass media, that's just a myth. The data shows something else. So I think we have time for one more question.
If we look at the school systems that we have in place currently, we're teaching most students how to basically tick boxes and be afraid to make mistakes. So my question is, if we follow this approach, are we going to hinder creativity in the future?
You've been hanging out with Peter Thiel, huh? You know, I studied one of the most important innovators of the 20th century. Her name was Grace Hopper, and I wrote a book about her. And when she was a professor, what she liked to do was every semester, even though she had a full workload, she would go audit multiple classes. So she was a mathematics PhD and taught mathematics, but she took a class on art history, she took a class on biology, she took a class on philosophy. In my mind, creativity occurs when you commingle different types of expertise. When you commingle different types of expertise. Where I will agree with you is that sometimes experts can also be the most blind to the possibilities. They get so shut into their boxes, their expertise, that they can't see it any other way. And I have a list of quotes from famous experts who can't even imagine what the future looks like. What we don't want to conflate, though, is lack of education or lack of formal education, or education and formal education somehow takes away from creativity. We do not want to conflate those things. That's a myth. That's not reality. All right, thank you very much for your time. Go Bears!